Absolute zero. Zero results of the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky after they conducted some talk in the White House. We have nothing. We have no tomahawks. We have no any other missiles which could bomb Russian Federation, and we have just talks from the United States that they don't want to have more further escalation. So this is the zero result. We can be upset here in Ukraine, but we cannot say that we were waiting for something bigger than this absolute zero. Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhnio. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on what is going on Ukrainian battlefield, not on the political battlefield, but on the warfare battlefield. Join this review. This is the overview of as of October the 18th. Watch this video, like it, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and leave your comments just below the video. Let's start. This isn't about Trump. This isn't a video about the White House as some might hype it up right now. Although, in the end, judging by the results of that meeting, there's nothing to hype up anyway. This video is from our frontline city of Kostiantynivka. What do we see in this video? Fantastic, wonderful people. A man who in Kostiantynivka, our frontline Kostiantynivka, saw that just 10 kilometers from the front line, right in the middle of the town, there was a robotic system, a ground robotic system of our 4th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, and a local resident, without any extra tools, without any instructions, without anything, just took it upon himself. And this is actually being filmed from the camera of the ground robotic system. He just took it and repaired it. The track had come off the ground system, and our man, right there in the frontline area, fixed it with his own hands. Fantastic people, wonderful people. We have such people. And this is an example that in frontline areas, not everyone is just waiting around. The local population, the civilian population, supports and helps the defense forces. Today, with this video about people, the most important video because people are our main resource, not tomahawks, but people, I am starting today's review. So, dear friends, of course, we will talk about the United States of America, and of course, we will talk about the meeting of the presidents, President Zelensky and President Trump. I'll be honest, I had higher expectations for this meeting, and no, those expectations were not about tomahawks. Those expectations were about other types of long-range weaponry, JASSMs or ATACMs or Barracudas, definitely not tomahawks. Personally, I wasn't expecting them, and I've said so publicly, repeatedly, and at length. I expected that the United States would be more interested, let's say, in the architecture of a new global security order. Trump said at the meeting that supposedly they are interested in our Ukrainian drones, but there were no significant results from that meeting. Even though we came prepared, do you remember those photos from the White House from the previous meeting? There in his hands, Pavlo Palisa, Colonel Palisa, the deputy head of the president's office, was carrying a map of military operations, the same kind that we reviewed together and that I comment on. A map showing the current situation at the front. And that was what convinced Trump at the time that Ukraine was not losing the war. In a global sense, Ukraine was not losing the war, as the media reported yesterday. Palisa was also responsible for maps, but to be precise, these were a different kind of maps that showed important sites of the Russian Federation on Russian territory, key objects of their military-industrial complex. If long-range weapons were to strike these targets, Putin would immediately be forced to start talking and, so to speak, begin negotiating for peace. Unfortunately, I can't say for certain that these maps didn't work, but after this meeting, this lunch with Donald Trump, President Zelensky essentially came out and said, well, to put it in non-diplomatic terms, I'm paraphrasing here. So for now, there won't be a check mark because he said that they agreed with Trump not to talk about these systems for the time being since the US does not want an escalation. And Zelensky did not comment on any questions regarding this topic. Besides that, the two presidents, and in general our delegations, agreed that they will work more on weapons production. According to the president, the US and Ukraine, together with other countries, will now work on the logistics of future deliveries. In addition, Trump told Zelensky about his conversation with Putin regarding the summit in Budapest. They talked about Budapest. But what will actually come out of Budapest in the end? It's unclear, and whether it will happen at all, even though yesterday the spokesperson for the Russian dictator confirmed it. The likelihood of a meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest in the next 2 weeks was mentioned by Zelensky. The issue of territory, which he said is very sensitive and the most difficult, was also raised since Russia would like to occupy all of Ukraine.
But the position is as follows. Zelensky says, let's first agree on a ceasefire so that we can then sit down at the negotiating table and talk about territories. After this summit, Trump also communicated, posting in English on his social network, Truth Social, and here is what he wrote. It's time to end the war, let both sides declare victory, and let history be the judge. This is my compiled summary of what he actually wrote. No more shooting, no more death, no more massive and unsustainable amounts of money being spent. Honestly, friends, it's about nothing, if we're being honest. Because there were high expectations for this meeting. Again, not about tomahawks, but about some kind of security framework. But it really seems that the American president has been fooled by Putin again, once more being convinced of his peacekeeping ambitions, his peacekeeping intentions. So our task remains unchanged. We keep chipping away at the rock. And even without American missiles, our fighters are striking targets on the territory of the Russian Federation or on occupied territories deep within the occupied territories. Yesterday, the Special Operations Forces fighters demonstrated how they hit several targets at once. In the area of Saki, as well as near Simferopol, especially interesting is this Gvardiiska airfield near Simferopol, which was hit. Let's watch the video from the Special Operations Forces. They really gave the Gvardiiska airfield a hard time, let's put it that way. They also struck the Gvardiiska plant on the territory of the occupied Crimean Peninsula at the Karyern checkpoint. They hit a number of targets overall, which, let's say, make up the military infrastructure of the peninsula. And what's noteworthy is that these strikes were carried out by the Special Operations Forces using our drones, middle strikes, FP2, produced by the Flamingo missile manufacturer Firepoint Company. To be fair, the FP1, our long-range drone, is probably the most effective right now, on par with the Lyut. So with the Lyut and the Boba drones, which fly over the territory of the Russian Federation. The Pi-2 is a mid-strike drone that delivers strikes at over 200 kilometers and has a warhead weight of about 100 kilograms, maybe even more. Well, we're waiting for the Flamingo. Our path is to develop the Flamingo and strike even more at enemy territory. In the same way, without waiting for American aid, the special unit of the National Guard of Ukraine, Lazar's group, which has now gone public, showed the destruction of an enemy Smerch. A very striking hit on the Smerch by our long-range, you could say, bombers, which are actually called Lazarai. This happened in the Kherson region, almost 50 kilometers away. The drone flew 50 kilometers, struck this Smerch, and basically blew it to pieces. This is the very same BM-30 Smerch that was terrorizing the right bank of the Kherson region, preventing Kherson residents from living a normal life. They tracked it down, destroyed it, and delivered this incredibly powerful bada-boom. Lazar's group, who have now started to go public, are showing the kind of long-range strikes they are delivering, again, I repeat, without waiting for the Americans. It's no coincidence that I deliberately started with this video featuring a man in our non-profit territories in Kostiantinivka, because we have the resource of wonderful people, truly fantastic people. Our gunsmiths, our military, our experts and specialists who know how to make weapons. Let's not just focus on the Americans and hope for them. Let's not freeze in place ourselves. That would be my rather romantic wish following this meeting between Trump and Zelensky. And now let's move on to the situation at the front. Today I want to focus on the section of the front located in the northeast. This will be about Kupansk, this will be about Lyman. Why is that? Because right now this location is essentially under the responsibility of a single group of troops.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
This direction is overseen by the Northern Group of Forces. This is what it's called in Ukraine by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The Northern Group of Forces was created as part of a new organizational structure within Ukraine's defense forces, because on October 6th, so in fact about 2 weeks ago, it was announced that the OSUB Kortitsia was being dissolved. Oh, sorry, not even OSUB Kortitsia, but OSUB Dnipro. What are OSUBs? OSUBs were operational strategic groupings. There were two of these groupings, one in the south and one in the east. For example, the OSUB Dnipro was responsible for a vast section, a wide defensive line on the eastern front. It was dissolved, as was reported on October 6th, and subsequently split into several groups. Yesterday, a more detailed post appeared from the Western analyst Unit Observer, which shows exactly how our military groups were divided. So we have the West military group, which is currently based in the Kiev and Chernihiv regions and is covering our northern borders. We have the North military group, which specifically includes exactly the Siversk, Vovchansk, Kupiansk, and Lyman directions. all of which I'm going to talk about in detail today. Next, we have the East Military Group, which includes the Donetsk region and the areas of the most intense fighting right now, including Pokrovsk, the Novopavlivka direction, and Kostiantinivka. And there is the South Military Group, which stretches from Zaporizhzhia further down to the Kherson region. In addition, there is a separate tactical group called the Kursk Military Group, which is responsible for the defense of the Sumy region and for the occupation of certain areas in the territory of the Kursk region. This is how these groups have been divided. The most important thing I would like to emphasize, and unfortunately this has largely gone unnoticed in the Ukrainian information space, is the role of Major General Mikhailo Drapati in these military groups. Because Drapati, as I put it, very quickly underwent a kind of status devaluation. Unfortunately, it's very regrettable because this person enjoys fantastic levels of support within Ukraine's defense forces. With Drapati, the official devaluation, let's call it that, happened extremely quickly because as recently as June of this year, Mikhailo Drapati, Mikhailo Vasilovich, was the commander of the ground forces with big ambitions and, let's say, was a contender for the position of commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. After that, following yet another transfer to one of the training centers, he resigned and was reassigned to a new position. The position of commander of the joint forces is now, well, I don't want to offend anyone, but it's more of a ceremonial general's role. At one time, the commander of the joint forces was supposed to be the commander of all the defense forces of Ukraine, as it was during the ATO and JFO, and at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev held that position. Later, this role shifted somewhat. Nayev was reassigned from commanding all the defense forces and assets to working in the north, strengthening the borders, working there. And since then, the position of commander of the joint forces has actually been combined with the fact that the CJS, that is the commander of the joint forces, was automatically also the commander of our eastern OSAG, first Khortytsia, then Dnipro. That was Sodol, and then now after Sodol, it was NATO. And now Drapati has taken over, or rather Drapati became the commander. So, since June, when he stopped being the commander of the ground forces, he became the commander of the Dnipro Operational Strategic Group. And now, as far as I know, Drapati commands one of our military groups. In fact, his responsibilities have been cut in half. His level of responsibility has decreased by half. Now he is on the Eastern Front, but I won't specify exactly where, whether it's in Donetsk or Kharkiv region. Drapati is in charge. I won't talk about that because as far as I know, this information isn't public. But unfortunately, such a professional demotion has happened. It just went unnoticed in Ukraine's information space. And today, I want to draw some attention to this information, so to speak. Let's move on. Let's finally get to the front. We'll be talking about Lyman today because in one of the recent episodes, there were comments from people asking why we aren't talking about Lyman, what's happening there. Here, the 3rd Army Corps is attempting to resolve the situation. It's obvious that the two Russian combined arms armies operating in this direction, namely the 20th and 25th, are unable to maintain a steady pace of advance and a consistent tempo of occupying these areas, including the occupation of Lyman. The 20th Combined Arms Army is operating in the north, right here in this salient on the right bank of the Zherebets River, on the bridgehead that exists here. The 25th Combined Arms Army is operating in the Yampil area, and it is quite clear that the Russians are not achieving any significant successes there or elsewhere. Yampil remains under control, even though Russian sabotage groups constantly infiltrate the area. The situation in the area of Drobyshev, which includes settlements like Shandry-Holov, is somewhat more complicated, and we are focusing specifically on this direction. So Shandry-Holov was captured by the enemy, as reported by Deep State. After that, the Russians advanced in the area of the settlement of Serednya. There is a natural obstacle here called the Nitrius River. This is the river with the reservoir in Novoselivka. Here is the river, and the reservoir is in the area of the village of Novoselivka. And it is precisely this reservoir, this natural obstacle, that has now become the main barrier preventing the enemy from advancing further toward the settlement of Novoselivka. Because just recently a video appeared from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, showing the clearing of sabotage groups in the area of Novoselivka. They show how they are destroying Russians on the western slopes of the Nitris River Valley. Here, the most important element is the forest complex to the west of the village of Novoselivka. This is part of the Sviaty Hory National Park. And it was here that the soldiers of the 3rd Army Corps of the Russian occupiers were overheated as they tried to hide in this forest and continue attacking Novoselivka. From time to time, Russian sabotage groups pass through there, but so far they have not been allowed to gain a foothold in Novoselivka, just like that. The soldiers of the 3rd Army Corps, although the intensity of fighting in this area, which, by the way, was highlighted by the very friendly community of Taras Hrihorovich, report, as you can see, exactly where these actions took place on the part of the 3rd Army Corps and the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, particularly to the north and northwest of Novoselivka. So the actions taking place here actually demonstrate that the enemy has a great interest in this area, because every single day, the Russian forces consistently drop massive destructive bombs from their advanced UMPC modules directly onto the entrenched positions of our brave troops in this particular strategically important area. And a very difficult defense is currently being held here by the forces of the 60th Separate Mechanized Brigade and one of the battalions of the 156th Brigade, as we understand, with the support of the 3rd Separate Assault Corps. In other words, the Russians have ambitions for Lyman, but the main point is that so far, these ambitions are not backed up by real results. At the moment, what is called struggling in English, they are really suffering here, not getting enough reserves or sufficient capabilities. So far, the 20th Combined Arms Army and the 25th Combined Arms Army do not have enough capabilities and resources in the Lyman direction to resolve the situation here. At the moment, it has turned out to slow down the enemy. This is not yet stabilization, but at least there is definitely a slowdown already in the Kupansk area and in the city of Kupansk itself. These are two interconnected, interdependent directions. What we are observing in Kupansk, despite all the panic and talk of betrayal, is that for now it is worth noting that the command on both sides, both Ukraine and the Russian Federation, are currently trying to somehow organize their units, bring them to a common denominator, because the tactics the Russians used in the city, the tactic of infiltration into the settlement, into the rather large settlement of Kupansk, this infiltration tactic led to what I already mentioned earlier this week. In reality, here, people, horses, rabbits, and everything imaginable are all mixed together. One house is occupied by our military positions, the next house by Russian military positions, and they are adjacent to each other. Sometimes they barely know about each other for hours on end. The situation is extremely intense, and there is a wide movement of our combat formations happening here. Judging by everything, it can be said that the occupiers have entered Kupiansk in quite large numbers. On our side, unfortunately, we truly have to acknowledge and say that there are simply not enough personnel available to effectively hold these critical areas here, to simply physically drive the enemy completely out of those specific parts of Kupiansk they have already occupied using dedicated assault troops on foot. Therefore, so far, no miracle has happened in Kupiansk, but it cannot be said that anyone fully controls this city. Ms. Bezula, Member of Parliament Bezula, mentioned and said this week, as we are summing up the week, she said that supposedly that's it. Kupiansk is lost, almost lost. The defense forces do not control the settlement. This does not quite correspond to reality, and I want to emphasize that. This does not correspond to reality in the sense that, in fact, no one has actually decided the fate of Kupiansk. Neither the defense forces nor the armed forces of the Russian Federation control it. This is the situation we have in our northeastern direction. With this, I will put a period on today's weekly summary review. Please, friends, thank us for our work, give us likes, write comments, and subscribe. Stay healthy, all the best, and see you next time.